This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Radio stations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations. "1969, the year of my birth, the United States landed on the moon. So they say. Today we have author Randy Walsh talking about his books, The Apollo Moon Missions, Part 1 and 2, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. If they staged the landing on the moon, what was that staging for? What was the purpose of staging the moon landing? And we're going to find out the evidence that this was a hoax. So let's get right to it. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. Please welcome to the Truth Be Told studios, author Randy Walsh. Hello, Randy.
Hello, Tony.
Well, I have been excited to have you on. I'm sorry we had to reschedule back in July, which was really close to the actual date of the 53rd anniversary.
53rd, yeah.
Like I said, it's the same year I was born, so I better remember the actual many years. Or maybe I don't want to remember that many years. But before we get started, and we know what your take is, but I want to get your credibility because you're actually a commercial pilot. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us your background?
Sure. Yeah. So just first off, as one Irishman to another, happy to be here. So I'm glad we connected.
Right.
And I found that out with your interview with Anthony Summers that you have some Irish in you. So
I do.
Good interview, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, he really is. Anyway, so I started off with a private pilot's license about 35 years ago. And I've always had an interest in flying and always wanted to make a career out of it. But more than that, I did have a definite interest, a hobby. And of course, that led into anything that had to do with space-based technology, NASA, right. The whole thing. So when I had the opportunity and the available funds, then I upgraded from a private license to a commercial pilot's license. And then from there, really the only way to get into the business in order to build up hours and to build up time is to instruct. So I got an instructor's right. There's several ways of doing it. You can go through the military, you can go into instructing, you can become a bush pilot. There's a variety of ways. The best way for me that suited me was actually instructing, and I ended up really liking it. So I built up my career and my hours and my time as a pilot as instructing. And then while an instructor, I added more ratings to so I started off as a single engine pilot, then I added a multi-engine rating.
Oh, wow.
And then I added an instrument rating, which is really imperative if you're going into commercial flying.
Right.
And that's and from there, that's really how it happened. And it sort of just happened sort of in increments like that. So, and of course led into my, it really helped in terms of my research for the Apollo missions. It doesn't make me an expert, and I want to clarify that, but it does help when it comes to the technological aspect of looking at the Apollo missions.
And that's why I wanted to ask you that because, like myself, I'm not anything near commercial pilot of anything. I barely even fly a kite, but it is important when you're doing research like this when it comes to the NASA and space exploration and landing on the moon, especially, 53 years ago when we have not even been back and so long. You wonder why. That's one. So what made you get into this journey of finding out if this is or isn't a hoax? Because we've heard about this for years. Was it staged on a Hollywood stage? Was it, all these different things? So what got you interested in this journey?
Yeah, very interesting question. And everybody has a particular reason. I certainly had mine. This happened probably about 20 years ago. I just happened to come in one evening from work and usual routine, dinner, turn on the TV, and it happened to be a documentary. Back then, I don't even know they have this channel anymore because it was 20 years ago. A&E had a documentary about the Apollo missions. And I wasn't really paying much attention to it, but, just sort of walking back and forth while doing other things and just sort of listening to it occasionally. But then something caught my ear, and I realized there was one scene in the documentary where they had 3 specific astronauts from one of the Apollo missions, and they were talking about using the gravity of the moon as a slingshot to swing around the back of the moon and head back to Earth. I knew right away they were talking about Apollo 13. Now, for those of you who are new to this and are not familiar with the details, Apollo 13 supposedly had an accident on the way to the moon. So it blew an oxygen tank, and it basically destroyed the command server's module engine. So they were in a very precarious situation. They were minutes away from catastrophe, so they really had to work fast. That's the official narrative. So anyway, when the captain of that mission, Jim Lovell, was talking in the documentary, he was talking, and I'm just paraphrasing here, to the point where he was saying that, when I fire the engine, no matter what I do, when you fire the engine, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. Now, that's exactly what he said in the documentary. And I remember thinking to myself at the time that's very strange, because in essence, what you're doing is you're using visual cues for navigation 250,000 miles away from Earth. That's a very, very precarious way of navigating. And I knew right away that there was something wrong with this whole narrative, because when you're traveling any distance, you of course you have to constantly correct. And we learned this in navigation in terms of flying, and I had enough knowledge of navigation at that time to realize that for what he was talking about was an impossible feat for a human being to do, is to visually navigate from 250,000 miles from the moon to the Earth. So that was a red flag for me. Now, and actually it wasn't quite 250,000 miles out. It was about, at that point when they were doing the burn, was about 120,000 miles out from Earth, but still nonetheless, that's quite a distance. And if you're off by 1 degree, even less than 1 degree in your calculations, you're thousands of miles off course.
Right.
And given that you're thousands of miles off course and a very limited capacity for propellant, you're not getting back on course. You're going to find yourself marooned in an elliptical orbit forever, eternity, around the Earth and the moon. So that was my first red flag. I mean, up until that point, I grew up. I remember watching the Apollo. I remember actually watching Apollo 11 lift off live in school. I mean, I was a kid, little child, and I remember watching. Didn't fully understand what it was, all about, but I knew it was an historical event. I mean, I knew that much. So, I mean, I grew up believing it, and I found it at the time an inspiring venture on the part of mankind. So, I was no different than anybody else. I believed that these missions were real, but that was my first red flag, and I went from there and started looking a little bit deeper into it. And I didn't actually get into it until about several years later, and I realized that there was a lot more that I need to look at. So that's basically how it started.
Well, what's funny is, I mean, even looking at these capsules and thinking it was so small compared to even what they have today. I couldn't even imagine just taking that journey and that trip for the first time up into space, let alone trying to land on the moon. Do you think we had the capability at that time to land on the moon, or do you think space was pretty much going up and coming back down? Because at the time there was a lot of rockets that were exploding, during testing. So, do you think we had the capability at that time to land on the moon?
No, I don't. And we certainly had some capabilities, but nowhere near what NASA was telling us. I mean, at that time, when JFK made the announcement, and I believe it was 1961, to the United Nations, that the goal was to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. I think at that moment, they had the total experience of 15 minutes as a suborbital flight with a manned spacecraft, NASA with Mercury, with the Mercury project. And considering that we had no capabilities of even doing repairs in space, there was no capabilities of any kind of a rescue mission. And from that point, in about just over 7 years, you're expecting to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth is a technological feat that can't be matched today.
Yeah. And that's what I always thought, that, you know, I can understand how we would maybe have the ability to go into space, maybe even get to the moon. But like you said, landing on the moon, exiting the craft, getting back on the craft, and then coming back to Earth safely, that would be almost a miracle to be able to perform that.
Exactly. And I mean, there are a lot of engineers that were within that program. And another thing I just want to point out is that there were no space engineers back then. This was a new, and this is again another aspect that people don't realize, that this was a new area of expertise, a new area of research.
Right.
So they had to take these engineers from the aerospace industry, I mean the airline industry, and move them over and train them
Right.
in orbital mechanics and everything that entails. And that too took a lot of work. So they were, I mean, you're talking about an enormous learning curve here that probably, realistically speaking, if they had to start in 1962 and kept up that learning curve, you're probably looking at about 4 to 5 decades from even one attempt to land a man on the moon. I mean, I think I'm being generous with that.
Right.
And that's going with present technology. And the long and short of it is that the technology that they claimed they used in the 1960s to land men on the moon is just not feasible technology for transporting humans. We've sent unmanned missions there, but look, as I think you mentioned earlier, look at the problems they've had with unmanned missions. I mean, they've had a 50% failure rate
Right.
in the last several decades of unmanned missions. But lo and behold, when we send manned missions up there, which are far more complicated because you have to keep humans alive. So you're talking about an enormous level of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, all the manned missions are perfect. It doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. Now, I know when I say no way, people sort of come back at me and say, well, give us some evidence. But you have to look at the details, right? And when you look at the details and you look at their success rate regarding unmanned missions versus manned missions, then something doesn't add up.
Right. Right. So Neil Armstrong, the first man supposedly to walk on the moon. I know he avoided this question pretty much all his life, but other astronauts, have you ever had the opportunity to interview other astronauts that may have given any inclination that this may have been false, or other NASA former employees that you got to talk to that may have said that this was not possible or did not happen?
Yeah, so good question. First of all, to your first question, no, I haven't had the opportunity to interview astronauts. And for those that have interviewed astronauts, in particular Bart Sabril, look what happened to him. It can be a very precarious line of questioning when it comes to stepping on a hero's toes there. So you got to be very careful, right? Perceived hero, let me put that in there. I have had some contact from people that were indirectly involved. Recently, actually, I had a person who was indirectly involved with the Apollo missions, and she actually had worked in the corporation that was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was responsible for a lot of the technology that was used on the Apollo guidance computer.
Right.
And she had emailed me recently after reading my books, and she basically said that I'm on the right track here, keep going. And, you know, she has talked to a lot of people herself that were involved in the Apollo missions, and she had a lot of questions about it herself. She's now retired. And I have to admit, it was very nice hearing from her. And so, yes, I got a lot of support. So I have had a couple of emails from people that were indirectly involved. But it's very difficult to, especially in the last couple of years when I published my 6th book, we weren't allowed to travel. So, and I don't think I'm going to get an interview from Buzz Aldrin.
No.
I just don't think that's going to happen because
Oh my God,
I'm out
wouldn't that
there
be great?
already. My YouTube channel, my books, my BitChute channel. So he knows,
He knows you exist.
Yeah. So he pretty well knows where I'm coming from. Where Bart Sibrel had the advantage of interviewing most of these astronauts in the early 2000s. And so there wasn't a lot of online information about Bart Sibrel at that time. So basically, when he approached them, they had no idea that they were going to be interviewed by somebody who was questioning the validity of the Apollo missions. So he had a leg up on that.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, somebody in the chat room, and for anybody that wants to ask a question for Randy, please put that in the chat room. We'd love to hear from you. But Angela did say this, and this is kind of an interesting question. Well, not even a question, a comment. She says, in my own home, there are times where my cell phone struggles to receive reception. We're supposed to believe NASA was communicating real time with astronauts on the moon. At that time, I mean, now there's tens of thousands of satellites out there. At that time, what was the satellite? How did they communicate so well with the Earth? I know they did lose some connection, I think, during the landing. Is that correct?
Yeah, not so much during the moon landing. That was when they were re-entering Earth's atmosphere.
Maybe that's what it was.
I think there was a 2-minute communications blackout because of the ionized particles around the spacecraft as it was re-entering the atmosphere.
Right.
And then they had contact with them before they splashed down. I think that officially speaking, that is. I just want the viewers to realize that when I'm talking about it, and I say, oh, they did this and they did that, I just want everybody to know we're talking within the official narrative in terms of what NASA is saying. So I have been sort of accused to say, well, you just said they went to the moon. No, I'm talking within the official narrative.
Correct.
And
right.
I'll let people know when I step out of that. But yes, terms of community. Now, you want to know about communications in general?
Yeah. So how did they communicate so well, and even video communication in 1969, when they do even have trouble? Even my cell phone, I'm in Los Angeles, and I hit patches of areas that still, pretty much no bars, which is surprising. But in 1969, they had video and audio, and it seemed to be fairly good connection.
Yeah, it's really amazing when you think about it, because back then we didn't have GPS. At least it was in the early stages with the military, but we certainly didn't have it on a commercial level like we have now. We didn't have the communication through satellites. A lot of this was landlines, and still is to a certain degree. Right. A lot of our technology is still land-based in terms of communication. And so, but we weren't bouncing signals off satellites. I remember the first big event that we were all talking about was when Elvis Presley beamed his Aloha from Hawaii concert via satellite, to 1 billion people. And that was a big event. And we were like, wow, how is this possible? So, and that was after the Apollo missions. So it gives you an idea. Technically speaking, what they did was they were relaying communications back to 3 land-based receivers. And one of them was in Australia. The other one was in California. I think the other one wasn't too far away. They're actually positioned in such a way where they would have continuous communications because of the rotation of the Earth. That's you realize, people have to realize that when you're going to fix something of this magnitude, you got to dot the I's and cross the T's, because people are going to come back and say, well, how did you maintain communications 24 hours a day with the rotation of the Earth? Because you would lose communications for direct line of sight.
Right, exactly.
Right. So, that's another important thing. And the other important part to remember is, even though this one particular tracking station was in Australia, remember, Australia was an ally of the United States at the time, still is, and it was all run by American personnel. and it was very controlled. So communications were not as open as free as people think. Now, technically speaking, the official narrative says is that the communications from the lunar surface were beamed back to those tracking stations. The tracking stations would then send that signal up to a satellite orbiting Earth. And then that signal would be sent to Mission Control in Houston. And then from there, that signal would be sent out. And that's the official version. So people were not really watching a live feed. There was a several-minute delay if they actually landed on the moon.
Right.
So they weren't really watching a live feed. And I just want to add one more thing, because this is very interesting, because I had people come back to me and say, well, what about the ham radio operators at that time? They claimed that they were listening in on these missions. No, because that's a falsehood for one reason, because they were actually communicating in a wave, let's see, it was a wavelength that was not accessible to radio operators. And having said that, if these missions were supposed to be beamed live, and at any moment in that atmosphere, anything could have gone wrong. So they're going to want number one, they're going to want a communications delay in order to prevent that information from getting out. And number two, they're going to make sure that no ham radio operator is going to be able to access those communications. Remember, the Apollo mission was run entirely and staffed entirely by the U.S. military.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Now, we all know when it comes to the U.S. military, or even up here in Canada, the Canadian military, any military, they have their own communications frequencies, their own communications channels. They monitor, as a pilot, I can monitor 121.5, which is the standard frequency for emergency. But they have their own frequency that they monitor, as well as 121.5. They have their own special frequency that they monitor amongst each other. We're not privy to that, but they're privy to our communications. Right. We're not privy to theirs. So that's how the military works. So that's a big thing that people should remember. So number one is no, there's no absolutely no way, technologically speaking, that they could have communicated as efficiently as they did from the lunar surface and back.
Wow. Well, I know, living here in Hollywood, I mean, I've never really done a movie. I've been on a TV series before. In fact, that's how I got started years ago on a reality show. So I know the cast and crew and everything it takes to put something like this on. And a lot of people had to be a part of this. Like you said, you know, the people back at NASA had to pretend they were, you know, at Mission Control, and the generals and the, you know, other staff and the astronauts. So how did they keep this so under wraps? And where did they film this? Where did this take place? Because they would have had to have a big set, which, I mean, they could have done that in any big building. I mean, out here there's right out my window is NBC, Universal, and Warner Brothers, and I see where they film many TV shows. But where did they film this, and how did they keep this so under wraps with so many people being a part of it? Yeah,
very good questions there, Tony. You're keeping me on my feet tonight.
I try.
Okay, so to your first question, how could they have kept this under wraps? And that's a very good question, because there's an estimated, I think it was between 350 to 400,000 people working on this project back in the 1960s. Now, you can go back a little further to the Manhattan Project when they were working on the atomic bomb,
right,
and they had about the same number of people, and they all managed to keep a secret.
True.
But that's a small comparison. The point that I really want to make here is that when you break down the process of how the Apollo missions were designed, developed, manufactured, and then put into actual service, you're looking at misnomer is that NASA did everything. NASA did not do everything. NASA had to contract this work out. So NASA contracted this work out to 6 major corporations.
Oh, wow.
Then from there, these 6 major corporations subcontracted the work out to about 20,000 corporations, 20,000 smaller entities or businesses across the country. So yeah, you had 400,000 people working on this, but not 400,000 people working at this all at once. It was over several years, and they were throughout the whole of the continental United States. So how does the person working on a part on the lunar module know whether his or her part was actually launched into space? They don't know. You know because you watch CBS and Walter Cronkite told you that.
Right, exactly.
But you have no other way of knowing that except for what the mainstream media tells you. That was your go-to source for news.
Yeah, they didn't have cell phones and social media and all that.
Exactly. So it's like any corporation. How does the person in middle management know what upper management is planning? And about upper management, how would they know what upper management is planning? How does the person working in the office know what the overall agenda is going to be? They don't. We don't. And it's the same thing with NASA. It's the same thing with the personnel working in Apollo moon missions. How did they know what the end game was here? It's impossible. And you had a lot of you had a lot of activity going back and forth back then. There's no doubt about that. And there was a lot of contracts being made. But you have to sort of look at it from another point of view, is that if you're, as I said earlier, if you're going to fake something, you better fake it really, really well.
Right.
You've got to get all the details done. Dot the I's and cross the T's, as I always say.
And that's what somebody in the chat room said that, where was it? I agree with Randy. Ancient Ruby says they filmed on set because they messed up the lighting, and I saw pictures of the evidence. So I have heard that over the years, that people have seen, lighting or angles or, movement that said that just didn't look like it should have been on the moon.
No, and that brings me to your second question. Where were these filmed? Now, there has been rumors that, number one, that that famous producer, I forget his name right now, he produced the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Wow.
It'll come back to me. Regardless, a famous producer, and it was rumored that he was involved in producing and filming the Apollo missions. Now, I don't know if that's true. I always get a little bit hesitant when talking about the actual photographic and film record, because it's very easy to manipulate. And especially now, a lot of these photos have been manipulated, and film has been manipulated as well. So you can't really rely on that. You have to look at the technology. But still, nonetheless, the photographic and film record is still an interesting aspect to look at. So the consensus that I have right now is that it was filmed in Flagstaff, Arizona. That's the consensus that I have. And this is true, actually. They did have a site in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it's still, to this day, is not open to the public. And they had actually replicated a whole 2 square mile, how shall I say, they built a replica set of the lunar surface where Apollo 11 was supposedly going to land. And they built a whole replica of that. And they used photos from unmanned satellites that they had sent up in there in the 1960s specifically for that reason, was to map the lunar surface, and they built a full replica. And they actually filmed all the rehearsals in that replica site. And it was actually filmed by the National Geographic. They all had this on record.
Wow.
It's out there. And they're on record of actually saying that. So you can go from there and use your imagination. It's not a stretch to say, well, if they were doing that, could they have had some kind of photographic technology to give the impression that it was actually on the moon? Well, that's a very good question, because a lot of people back then, and even today, don't realize that the U.S. military has the biggest recording studios in the world. Far bigger than what Hollywood has.
Right.
So, and not only that, but a lot of the films that the U.S. military had made back then from the 1940s, 50s, 60s are still classified to this very day. So I suspect that they had far more technology when it came to photographic and film capability than we know of even today.
A lot of people are loving this, by the way, and people have put in the chat room Stanley Kubrick.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you out there.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah.
Stanley Kubrick.
They knew. They were like, so
Yeah.
thank you guys for sharing that. We love that. And so far, Angela again said that this is so refreshing to hear the conversation today. So thank you guys so much for listening. Please, if you have a question, put it in the chat room, and I'll ask directly to Randy. I'm sure he's happy to answer. And we love these conversations. You know, we love when people interact. So thank you, and make sure you like this show, by the way. So also, the biggest question is, okay, a lot of people were involved. You know, a lot of money. I'm sure this wasn't cheap to put this hoax on. So why did they do this? What was the big reason to put the wool over not just America's eyes, but the world's eyes?
Yeah. So there's a lot of quite a few answers to that question. That's quite a rabbit hole to go down.
Oh, I'm
I
sure.
will go down it slightly. We probably need a full show for that one alone,
Right.
but it's a very, very intriguing subject. Now, to understand that, you have to understand something else, that the Soviets at that time the Soviets, now Russia, of course, would have been privy to a lot of what was going on within NASA, and they would have known, just not even so much from any spies that may have infiltrated NASA, but they would have known just from the schematics alone whether a certain technological aspect of the Apollo missions was possible or not.
Right.
So this gets into the almighty F1 engines of the Saturn V, and I'll get back to that in a second. The Soviets knew full well that this wasn't going to happen. So the question is, if this wasn't going to happen, and the Americans knew the Soviets knew that, then was there something even deeper going on at that time? It was the Cold War. The consensus is that the Americans wanted to land men on the moon to divert away from the Vietnam War. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that they wanted to intimidate the Soviet Union, who was the other superpower at that time, into believing that the Americans were far superior. That's another possibility. I don't think that for me, is as intriguing as it is, doesn't really hold up. I think, and I wrote about this in my second book, there's actual evidence that the Americans and the Soviets were working together behind the scenes. They both knew these missions weren't going to happen.
Now that's an interesting one. I didn't hear that before.
Yeah. And I came across some information on that on a website called aulis.com. That's AULIS.com. They devote their whole website to the Apollo moon mission hoax. They have some really good work on there. And I came, and through my own research, I started being very suspicious about the F1 engines, because the F1 engines did not perform. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that in a second. The F1 engines were needed to lift the payload off the launch pad. And in order for that to happen, the F1 engines they were the most powerful engines ever built, most powerful rocket engines ever built. They have not been used since, and they have not been able to duplicate that since, right? So I want to give a little bit of perspective on what that means.
Please.
So the average rocket engine back then, in the Saturn rockets, produced, the average one rocket would produce about 200,000 pounds of thrust. So if you had 8 rockets, you'd have like 8 rockets on one engine, which was the rocket, the Saturn 1B. You're looking at about a total of about 1,600,000 pounds of thrust. That's a total. Now, the Saturn 1B, for those who don't know, was used in the Apollo 7 mission. The Apollo 7 mission it didn't go to the moon. It was just an orbit around the Earth. That was to test the Apollo command module and the service module, and of course the Saturn 1B rocket. All right. Now, go forward to the Saturn V. This is the next development rocket. The Saturn V used what is called the F1 engines. Each F1 engine had to produce a minimum of 1.5 million pounds of thrust. That's one engine. Already you see that matches the 8 engines I just mentioned. And there was 5 of these engines on the first stage of the Saturn V. Now, the Saturn V stood 363 feet. This was a huge rocket, and it weighed 3,000 tons when it was fully loaded with propellant. That's
Right.
the size. That's about the mass of a Navy destroyer.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And each of those engines, 1,500,000 pounds of thrust was needed to lift that rocket off the launch pad to get it up to an altitude where they can then discard that first stage into the second stage. Now we're talking the first stage, a combined total of 7.5 million pounds of thrust.
Woo.
There has been no rocket since that has been able to come close to producing that kind of output, and there has no rocket since that has worked as efficiently as that apparently did.
Wow.
So here's my point. Is with the F1 engines, they were having major problems with that. And there was a major instability problems with the F1 engines. They weren't firing as according to what we were being told. There was a whistleblower, inside whistleblower, his name is Bill Casing. He actually worked for the corporation Rocketdyne, who built the F1 engines. So they were contracted by NASA to build this F1 engine, which was actually started by the military, then Rocketdyne took it over. And that he noticed, and he worked there from 1958 to 1963, and that's when the F1 engines were in development.
Right.
Now he noticed that they were fudging data from the F1 engine output, and that the best that they got was in 1959. They got an output from the F1 engine in their static test of about 1 million pounds of thrust, and they were only able to sustain that for a millisecond. Now, this is what Bill Casing noticed. He resigned in 1963 out of disgust. He didn't want to be part of this because at that time now the F1 engines were being manufactured for the Apollo missions. Now, here's why you needed that amount of power. A 7.5 million pounds of thrust is because it had to lift 46 tons of payload into low Earth orbit. So that included the command module, service module, and the lunar module. So together that was a combined total of 46 tons. And that was needed just to get it off the launch pad. So if those engines were not working perfectly, then you've got a problem.
Yeah,
it's not one engine doesn't work perfectly, the whole mission fails. And the Soviets knew this. They knew this at the time. They could tell by just even the advertisement and the schematics that were allowed for publication, that is,
right,
that these engines wouldn't work, and they knew this at the time. And it goes even deeper than that because there is now evidence that the Soviets actually had picked up an aborted command module after launch, and that was the launch of Apollo 13.
Wow.
So Apollo 13 was launched on April 11th, and right around the time that Apollo 13 was launched, there was a Soviet nuclear submarine lurking in the waters of its flight path in the Atlantic Ocean. So remember, when the Apollo missions blasted off, they moved east towards the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
Okay. So there was a window of opportunity where they had, they might have had to abort, and then a point where they just had to keep going. So there's evidence now that, and I mean actual evidence, that Apollo 13 was aborted right after its launch for whatever reason, and a U.S. Soviet submarine had been tracking this and gave the information to a Soviet destroyer to have this picked up. And the proof is always in the pudding. And 5 months later, the Soviets had officially returned a command module to the American government. This was 5 months later. This is all on record. This is just photos of this. And it was reported in the local news media at the time. And so the question is, now we have 2 Why do we have 2 Apollo 13 command modules? You actually have 2 Apollo 13 command modules. Why is that? Well, of course, they had to cover the story. But the inference is that there was no pilot, there was no astronauts on board. It had suffered a catastrophic failure, had aborted, and the Soviets picked up the command module. They claimed they found it floating. This is April 12th. The next day after the launch, they picked it up. And then they officially handed back this command module to a U.S. Coast Guard, USS Southwind. There's photos of this. It's all in my book. And there was communication between both the American and Soviet embassy at that time. They had picked up this capsule 5 months later, and nobody knows where this capsule came from. If this was a training capsule, or what's called a boilerplate, actually, a boilerplate is a capsule that is not operative, it's used for training. But how did it get there? There's no record at all of this capsule being used in any kind of training record. So you can only draw one conclusion, that it had to have come from Apollo 13. So the Soviets knew that the F-1 engines were not going to work. They knew that there was going to be a catastrophic failure, and they were lurking out there waiting for that, and they were in a position to pick it up when it happened. I go into a lot more detail. There's far more detail in the book about that, but that's the basic outline. That tells me one thing. Tells me that they must have been working together in some capacity at some point.
Well, what's funny is, because at least I don't remember, this could be somewhere, but they did not criticize, at least that I know of, that they never questioned it.
Yes.
Which is, I would think that if they, this was the space race era, that they would definitely want to be the first, that they were the first in space. They would want to be the first to the moon. So, yeah, I was surprised that they did not, and that makes sense. That makes sense that they didn't criticize it.
In fact, they congratulated the Americans, which is always a talking point from the proponents of these missions, is, well, the Soviets congratulated them. It was all in the newspapers. Yes, and you believe everything you read in the newspapers. And you believe everything that Walter Cronkite tells you, right?
Walter Cronkite.
But, yeah, it's just incredible. And I think now, today, especially given what has happened in the last couple of years, we're seeing that these governments around the world are not as independent as we once thought.
Yeah.
Is that there's an underlying force. And that force has actually always been there. It's been there for decades, longer. And we get into now, ties in with the JFK assassination, the Apollo moon missions, the whole lot. And there's a lot we probably can't talk about in terms of the censors, but you find that it's all connected. The Apollo missions was a psychological, as far as I'm concerned, it was a psyops. In part. I don't have the full answer. Nobody does. I think we'll get more of that in the coming years. I don't think it'll be too long, right? But I firmly believe, and remember, the Soviets and the Americans worked together in the Soviet Apollo orbit. Remember that, 1975?
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, how did they get the schematics? There's no way that they could have had the schematics. The schematics alone wouldn't have given them enough information in order to successfully dock with one another in space. So there's a theory, a possible theory behind that. And that is, there's a theory that Apollo 13, hypothesis actually, that Apollo 13 was deliberately aborted so as the Soviets could pick that capsule up, so they would have an actual close to a working model to fit their own spacecraft for their joint venture in 1975. Wow. So this is how far down the rabbit hole goes, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I just wanted to sort of touch on that to give everybody out there an idea that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Very, very, very deep rabbit hole it goes. So that's some idea of where this is. So there's no one easy answer to your question, Tony.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what fascinates me, and somebody was saying in the chat room, I was looking to see how many times have humans been on the moon. Well, it shows, I mean, just from when I'm kind of glancing through Google, which, like you said, believe what you want to believe, but 12 people, astronauts have, is that what it says, had landed on the moon or had walked on the moon?
Yeah, officially speaking.
Officially.
The narrative is 12.
And then, but then in the chat room, let's see, Steve said, where was it? Where in the hell was it? That was, here it is. Who was the moron NASA officially that laughable exclaimed, "No, we no longer have the technology to return to the moon"? And they said Donald Pettit.
Yeah.
Which
Donald
is
Pettit.
funny.
He was,
it's like,
yeah.
it's almost like, let's say we went there and then all of a sudden it's like,
Yeah.
He
actually said that on camera. He was in an interview. Don Pettit. Now, for those
how in the hell is that?
I don't know. Don Pettit was, I think he was an astronaut. He actually was an astronaut, I think, on the space shuttle was, but I know he was on the ISS. That was his primary role, the International Space Station. And he was asked. I mean, he's a piece of work. This character. He's very interesting. He was asked in an interview about a possible moon mission. He said, I would go to the moon in a nanosecond, but we can't do that anymore because we destroyed that technology.
Why? What? What would they get it drunk at like one playing cards one night and they spill their beer on the
Well, I mean, it's incredible, Tony, because sometimes there is so much humor in this, and there's some tragedy too, and so I sort of try to take a balanced approach. But when you hear, I'll give you another one. Alan Bean was asked by, I believe it was Bart Sabrill. Alan Bean was one of the astronauts. I think he was on Apollo 12. I don't have all that in front of me right now, so I'm just going from my mind here. I believe he was on Apollo 12. He also was on the Gemini missions, and that the precursor, right, to the Apollo missions. And he was asked the question, did you experience any effects going through the Van Allen belts when you went to the moon?
And they're like, what's that? I'm just kidding.
Almost. You're not far off, Tony. You're not far off. His reply was, well, we didn't go out that far.
Huh? What?
And so the question, the interviewer, I believe again was Bart Sabrill, he was very calm and collected, came back and he says, well, Alan, you would have to have gone out that far because you would have had to go through the Van Allen belts, the radiation belts, to get to the moon. And Alan Bean, of course, realized that he made a huge blunder, came back and said, well, obviously there was no effects. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, there's one story after another. There's another story that is pretty strange, actually. And it came out in the open in 2009. Ron Howard, movie producer Ron Howard, right, wanted to make a documentary to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing.
Mm-hmm.
And, he did it. He had conviction. He really believed in it. He wanted to, commemorate the landing and, to honor the heroes. And at that time, Neil Armstrong was still alive. Neil Armstrong had died a couple of years later. But all three of the astronauts at that time were still alive. Well, one is still alive today, Buzz Aldrin. But at that time, all three of them were still there. So Ron Howard had come up with an idea, and what he wanted to do is project alive the images that were recorded from the lunar surface of them walking on the moon on IMAX. But in order to do that, he had to have access to the original footage, not the first generation or second generation copy. And there's much of that out there. He needed the original footage, the signal. So he contacted NASA and he asked for the telemetry tapes. Now, the telemetry tapes are what they have on them is three important pieces of information. You have the biomedical information for the astronauts, telemetry for the spacecraft, and the actual visual live feed of them walking on the moon. Excuse me. So NASA came back to him and said, well, we have a problem. We don't know where they are. And Ron Howard was really disappointed because he needed to access that particular those telemetry tapes in order to blow it up for IMAX. You couldn't do it with a generation copy.
Right.
Now, the importance of this is think of your favorite classic album of the 1970s and the master tapes disappear. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So it turns out that there were 14,000 reels of telemetry tapes from the Apollo 11 mission. That's a lot of information. Now, each reel, we're looking at big IBM computers back then. You know, the reel to reel.
Right. The room size.
So each reel contained about 15 minutes of information. So times that reel, which is about the size of your car driving steering wheel. So times that by 14,000. We're talking
that's big.
Really bulky stuff.
Yeah, that's big.
And NASA can't find them. And it gets better. But just to finish with Ron Howard, he ended up making his documentary, but he had to resort to using old VHS video footage for his documentary. He couldn't do the IMAX, obviously, right?
Right.
So I looked into that a little further. And I was thinking, how do you lose 14,000 reels of telemetry tapes? Well, then I looked at all the other missions. And all the other missions combined, the Apollo missions combined, and there was, I believe, 9 of them combined. 6 of them landed on the moon. So you had Apollo 7 that was in Earth orbit. You had Apollo 9, which was in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 that went to the moon and back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Apollo 11 on, those 6 missions landed on the moon. So you have a combined total of 140,000 reels of telemetry tapes for all those missions combined. And they're gone. They're nowhere to be found.
Wow.
Now, when they were wrapped up, packaged off after each mission, they were sent to the Goddard Space Flight Center. And then from there, they were sent to the Washington National Records Center. And it was from there that they disappeared.
Wow.
Now, I found out through NASA's own investigation that NASA personnel had signed these telemetry tapes out in the 1970s. Now, proponents of the mission say that the reason why they were signed out is because there was a shortage of tape and they needed those tapes. That's, first of all, you would not tape over the most significant scientific achievement of the 20th century.
That's like taping over your wedding.
Exactly. Yes, I can say that.
Right.
Yes. Absolutely. You would not do it. And number 2, the tape shortage didn't happen until the 1980s. Well, here we have evidence from NASA's own admission that these tapes are signed out. But here's the thing. Nobody in NASA knows who signed them out. They just know that somebody within NASA signed them out. They didn't even follow proper protocol.
Wow.
And they're gone.
Well, because
of one reason.
Because of time, can we do a part 2 because we're just getting started, but
sure, yeah.
I wanted to bring this up before we go, that on the way in today, I was listening to the news. That's the only time I actually even watched the news. But they were talking about NASA, talking about finally going back to the moon, building, living, and to prepping to go to Mars. So now we're going from a moon mission that, you believe it was a hoax, now going to Mars, which even to me is even more a potential hoax than even the moon. But what is your thoughts about now, after 50 years, finally going back to the moon and even building there and living there? Why the big 50-year gap that we didn't go back or start building bases or anything like that? What? Yeah. Because we definitely, I think, have the technology now to land there.
We have the technology to land there on man-wise. Now, if you're talking man technology, we have the technology to land there. We may have, but it would be technology that we don't know about, because the existing technology that we have right now cannot land a man on the moon.
Wow, that just baffles my mind.
Yeah, it's just not happening. And in answer to your question, when I hear that question, I think NASA as comedy writers. They've been saying they're going back to the moon for the last 20, 30 years. I mean, I remember back in the 1990s, they were going to go in the year 2000. The year
Right.
2000 came, they said, well, no, we're going to have to put this off for 5 years because we don't have the money. 5 years came later, George W. Bush decided we're going to send men back to the moon, and Obama took over. He says, no, we're going to cancel that program. We'll do it in 2020. Here we are again.
Right.
They keep saying it's going to happen, but it never happens. It's very much like when you look at Galactic Airlines and other billionaire airline owners who get very close to putting passengers in orbit. I'm not good at names tonight. Richard Banning, I believe his name is. Putting wealthy people into orbit,
Right.
and then something happens, there's an accident, and then it's put off for another 5 to 10 years.
Right.
It just seems like they want to keep us out of space.
Which
So, in answer to your question, quick answer is no. We haven't been back in 50 years. Well, we've never been there before. And you would think, like, you take the propeller-driven aircraft in the 1920s, Lindbergh, when he flew across the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
Look where we are in terms of aircraft. I liken rocket technology to the propeller-driven aircraft. It never went beyond that. It's really weird because the rest of our technology has made a lot of progress. It's been refined, it's been built upon, but not when it comes to rocket technology. It's still propulsion. It's still using propulsion techniques, and it's a lot of energy to get a rocket off the ground, and you still have a 50% failure rate. So something's wrong here. You have to look in terms of that. They have not built on that technology.
All right, and one last question. Do you believe aliens, extraterrestrials are on the moon?
You know what? Boy, you're really throwing it at me tonight, Tony. Yes, actually,
Well,
I had my doubts, but there's a lot of information coming out now, especially in the last year. You have the military disclosing some UFO
Right.
information and admitting to that. You have the U.S. government now on the verge of disclosing, and the European governments disclosing some very serious information out there, UFO experience. I had my own UFO experience 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So I do believe that there is a lot to it. Now, whether they're on the moon or not, I don't know, but there's a lot about the moon we don't know. And I don't think and I know for a fact that NASA and conventionally paid scientists who are controlled by government funding are not telling us. So I wouldn't rule it out. I'll leave it open for now, but I think the moon is a big mystery. We don't know anything about this moon. That information has been kept from us.
Well, this has been great. Like I said, everybody was saying yes to a part 2, so I hope you agree. And I think we have another couple hours to go on that. And just to let people know, you can get the books. You can go to Amazon and the Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1, Part 2. Somebody did want to know, are you going to write a Part 3? Is there enough for a Part 3?
Yeah, actually, I'm working on a third book right now that's going to have one chapter. It's about everything else that actually we're talking about. And I'm going to have one chapter on the Apollo missions. And then there will be a fourth book after that, which would be on the Apollo missions.
Oh,
So,
great.
yeah, I'm taking a bit of a break to get into other research right now, and then I'll be going back to it. But there will be a chapter in my upcoming book, some updates on the Apollo missions. So, yes.
Well, and also for Truth Be Told, you can go to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, watch this over and over, listen to our podcast on iHeart and radio.com and pretty much everywhere, Apple. We'd love to have you like and leave a subscribe to our channel, to leave great comments. That's always great for us. And also coming up April 1st, 2023, Truth Be Told, and I created a brand new company called Parapod, and what it is going to be, it's going to be a festival here in Santa Clarita, California, and it's going to be all about paranormal, ghost, UFOs, crypto, maybe even we're going to have true crime, and maybe even Randy will come and speak at the conference. So I want to put the link in the chat room. The tickets go on sale very soon, and great speakers and a lot of fun. So you can check that out, and you'll hear more about it in the coming weeks. And Randy, if people can go to your website, authorrandywalsh.com. I know you have a Instagram also. Is that the same, author Randy Walsh?
Yes, I think it's actually in the book. I can read it to you here. I can send you a link. It's author Randy Walsh, and they can contact me at Facebook at author Randy Walsh.
Perfect. Well, it's been great, and thank you so much for sharing your amazing research and your experience on the journey of putting these books together. It's so much fun to go on your journey with you, so I really appreciate it. And for everybody else, please watch Robert Hensley on Monday. He does the Minuteman Report, and Bonnie Burkert does Truth Be Told Transformation, which is more of the spiritual guru, yoga, all that good stuff. And of course, me every Friday right here on Truth Be Told YouTube channel. So, but until next time, I'm Tony Sweet. We'll see you very soon. And again, Randy, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Tony.
This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.